I wanted to write a book because, particularly around happiness, populated by good academic evidence, because I wanted to try to sort of write something that would actually work for people. Because, of course, we all know that self-help books don't work, right? And, of course, the reason self-help books don't work is because they sell so fucking many of them. Is that the single biggest factor predicting whether you're going to buy a self-help book is having previously bought a self-help book. Because a self-help book will say things to you like, be positive. And you're like, yeah, no shit, I worked that out. How do I actually do that? And you get no advice or guidance on how to implement any of the things that are recommended in the self-help books. And so the reason it's happiness by design is because it's how you can design your environment and organize your life in ways that make it easier for you to do the things that make you happy and harder for you to do the things that don't. And the simple behavioral science lesson, this is really the simple, basic behavioral science lesson, really obvious common sense lesson. If you want to do something, make it easy. And as you think about a lot of what you do in your life, you actually make it very hard for yourself to do the things that would make you feel happier. And so I talk a lot in the book, in the second part of the book, about what the lessons from the behavioral sciences can tell us, that's economics, psychology, neuroscience, and others besides, tell us about how you can organize your life, design your day and your environment in ways that just make it easier for you to do things that will make you happier without having to think too hard about it. Because the brain is lazy, it wants to conserve attention or resources and energy, and it will go with preset options. You basically live your life on autopilot to some large degree. You're making thousands of decisions every day. Most of those are automated, most of those are habitual. And it's a bloody good job too, because you actually literally had to think about every decision, your head would explode. And so the brain is trying to create habit loops in the environment. So the way that you're going to be happier is not by thinking yourself happy, which is what all the self-help genre tells you, essentially, is to think differently, be positive. It's to actually design your environment in ways that make it easier for you to do things that will make you be positive. So it's an action-oriented approach to happiness. Also, the other thing that a lot of the sort of happiness genre don't do is give you very much guidance on actually what happiness is. It's a very kind of loose concept. Of course, it was first used by Aristotle, over 2,000 years ago, which had a very different meaning to how we interpret it now. And often, a lot of the times when we talk about it, it's a very, very broad and loose concept. We're not kind of very clear about what we mean by it. So I thought it was important that we were clear. I was clear, at least, about what I meant by happiness. And the subtitle of actually, the US subtitle of Happiness by Design is Change What You Do, Not How You Think. And that's a representation of the second part of the book, Change What You Do, Not How You Think. It's an action-oriented approach. So it's nice it's called Action for Happiness, action in happiness, happiness from doing, and not just from trying to think differently. The UK and everywhere else subtitle is Finding Pleasure and Purpose in Everyday Life. The American editor said that wouldn't work in America because they need to be told what to do. It's more directive. They're basically stupid. So finding pleasure and purpose was a kind of bit kind of vague for them. But finding pleasure and purpose in everyday life. And I make the case for why I think happiness is first of all located in our experiences, in what we do, how we feel with the people that we're with, engaged in the activities that we're engaged in. But there are two components to happiness. It is a hedonic experience. It is about fun and pleasure and the absence of pain and misery and anxiety and worry and stress. There's also another important component to happiness in our experiences, in our day-to-day lives, and that's purpose. Things that we find meaningful, fulfilling, and in contrast, things that we find purposeless and pointless and a waste of time. And that happy lives are ones that find the right balance between pleasure and purpose, between fun and fulfillment. And it's for you to work out for yourselves what that balance should look like. But that's the framework within which happiness is set. Because the third thing that happiness books do, so first of all, they tell you to change how you think, which is difficult. They're very unclear about what happiness is. And thirdly is that they give you a one-size-fits-all approach. Meditate. Do mindfulness. Actually, yeah, I'm sure for those people that want to do it, selecting to doing it, fantastic thing to do. But not everybody, I know this is going to come as a shock to some of you, not everybody wants to do mindfulness. I know, I feel like I've just kind of sort of said that, God doesn't exist in the church or something. But I'm all for people finding out for themselves what works for them. Actually, being mindful is a very good thing for us to do, but actually formalized mindfulness may not be for everybody. And so the key thing is to find those activities that you find pleasurable and purposeful. I have no prescription on what they ought to be, insofar as they don't harm other people, and for you to find the right balance between them. So that's kind of 5 minutes on happiness by design. You've obviously all bought it already anyway, because if you haven't, well, whatever, why not? And read it. You know that when people, it's really interesting when people, when they cite online bits of text from books, it's nearly always from the first chapter and very rarely from the last. So buy it and read it. But what struck me, there were a few things that struck me from Happiness by Design, or after its publication and the kind of response to it. There were there's a story in Happiness by Design that I told of a friend, and this kind of became quite a resonant story. It was a reason that the New Statesman have on the paperback the book that will make you quit your job, and it's the only time I talk about work in the entire book, I think. It's a story of a friend who worked at, are we being recorded? Yeah. Worked at Medialand. It's a 3-letter broadcasting company. She complained variously when we went for dinner one evening about everything to do with her job, her colleagues, her boss, her commute, everything to do with the job. And then she said, literally, without any hint of irony, at the end of the evening as we stood up, she said, I love working at Medialand. And that struck a chord with a lot of audiences that I spoke about that story to, because it appealed, I think, to their sense of things that actually make us feel good and bad in our experiences, moment to moment, day to day, and the stories that we tell about the things that ought to make us happy. Medialand was somewhere that she'd always wanted to work. Her parents were proud, her friends were jealous. How could she not be happy when she thought about how happy her job made her? But actually, in fact, she was miserable. And also, as a personal, I start Happy Ever After with a story of giving a talk or being on a panel discussion at Hay, or How the Light Gets In, one of the festivals. I was walking across the fields after having been on this panel discussion, and this guy about my age came up to me and he said, he sort of pointed, he said, Professor Dolan, I enjoyed Happiness by Design. I was like, great, good, started off well. He said, but why do you have to play the working class hero? Okay. He said, look at you doing it now. Apart from the fact of being dressed as a chimney sweep and singing Chim Chimney, I have no idea. I had no idea what he was talking about. Turns out that during the course of this panel discussion, I'd said fuck 3 times. And I'd said it as a means of emphasis on each occasion, but the only time I ever swear in the workplace is as a means of emphasis. And I'd also, that actual crime was made much more heinous by the fact that there were women on the panel. Those fragile creatures that can't take swearing. The conversation really, it didn't last very long. I thought I told him to fuck off. But no, I didn't actually. What was really interesting was that he had a narrative, an idea of how a professor at the LSE ought to act. And also, I had a lot of media coverage for the fact that I said in Happiness by Design that I don't read novels, for example. I think people don't understand that not all books are novels, because I do read a lot of non-fiction, just don't read fiction. But again, there was an assumption and a story around how a professor at the LSE ought to behave, not just in work, it's kind of one thing, but what I ought to be doing with my leisure time out of work. So I thought I'd actually write a book about stories and about narratives. Not just narratives that may get in the way of individuals leading lives that are best for them, in the case of my friend's story that I was telling you about Media Land, but also the judgments we make about how other people live their lives and the expectations we place on them according to the narratives that we create for them. By the way, because I'm a good academic and want to make my arguments based on evidence, there is no fucking evidence at all to show that swearing is a sign of low IQ, lack of intelligence, it's engaging in social environments like this, it's good for teaching, that's a nice study. And so we ought to, I think, at least to some large degree, be basing our judgments around how people live their lives on the basis of good evidence, and not only on, not even on, social conventions, social narrative stories that we're told or we tell about the lives that we should lead. So that's kind of where I got to. And one of the I don't want to give away too much of the book, of course, but one of the narratives that some of you may have seen was picked up from a talk I gave at this year's Hay Festival, was around marriage. Did anyone see any of that coverage? Where I basically said that, well, if you're a man, you should probably get married. And if you're a woman, you probably shouldn't bother. Now, I did caveat that, as any good academic would say. I've got no randomized controlled trials. I'm over-inferring from correlational data. I'd love to be able to randomize people into marriage or not. That would be a fantastic study. But on the basis of good evidence, there are many, many, many women out there who have never married and never had children who are just doing just fine. In spite of the narrative that, well, they're not really, are they? Bless her. Bless her. Maybe one day she'll meet the right guy and that'll all change. No, she won't. No, if she meets anyone, it's probably the wrong guy. And that will all change. She's going to die sooner. What was interesting was not just the reaction to that suggestion, but some of the response to that I got, which is really, really interesting. That I've long been interested in why we care so much about how other people live their lives in completely disproportionate ways to its direct impact upon us. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think maybe we need validation of our own decisions. And the last thing in the world I want, if it is someone who's got married and had kids and is fucking miserable, is seeing that those people who made different life choices are doing better than me. As if happiness is some zero-sum game, where if I'm doing badly, if they're doing well, I'm doing badly. We might be jealous. We might actually would have liked to have made the decisions. It's not just about marriage and kids, but alternative life choices. Because it's hard to be different. It's hard to swim against the tide of social expectations. And the last thing I need is people who have made those decisions reminding me of the fact that I'm unable or unwilling to do that. I don't want to talk about too much more about marriage and kids. There's a kid in here somewhere. I'm sure the parents are blissfully happy. But there's an interesting story about that. So, my kids are now. It's brilliant. When I wrote Happy Ever After, my kids were a bit older. When I wrote Happiness by Design, my kids were preschool, and there was no joy in that at all, in that experience. But because I'd said that, and I kind of was quite honest about the fact that you get moments of joy interspersed with very long periods of misery, they do just enough to stop you killing them. But somehow I was a bad parent or whatever for saying this. And again, these kind of narratives get created. It's brilliant, keep going. These narratives get created that we have to kind of buy into. And we almost feel as if we're failures if we aren't happy by the things that we're told that we ought to be. No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, really. I mean, that's totally compelling evidence. But what I want to conclude with is a set of narratives around attainment, achievement, and success. And you can think about this. We'll have this conversation a bit later, I think, about not just financial success or status or occupational advancement, but maybe even in our abilities to be happy or to do things that would make us happy. But I'll stick initially with the success narrative around attainment and achievement, because it's what we're expected to do, right? We're expected to want more, to strive for more, and to have goals and ambitions. And there's a huge amount of literature on how the absence of goals is harmful for well-being. Very, very little literature in comparison on how much too many goals, too much motivation is also harmful for happiness. It's a very boring response to most things, that life is about balance, that too little of something is bad for you, but too much is too. And it's actually, this is really quite distracting now. Okay. So, whatever your level of attainment or success or achievement, you're expected to strive for more. And you're judged very harshly if you don't, right? So if you took a job that was lower paying than the one that you currently have, you'd have to go into some elaborate explanation for why you did that. Yeah, like I've got better colleagues, a nicer commute, better people to hang out with, more time with people that I enjoy being with, all the things that would actually make me happier day to day, requires explanation. Whereas taking a job that pays more money, people just leave you alone, and that's, well, of course you would take that higher paying job. So it's ingrained in our expectations. And what that does is clearly not good for us, I think, beyond the point at which we've achieved just enough. And I talk in the book about what some of the evidence tells us around income and success in those regards. But what I want to really focus on now for the few minutes that remain is the judgments that we make about other people who don't achieve, or more importantly, those that don't strive to achieve. See, because it's all right if you try and fail, but you must at least try. So returning to the marriage example, if you construct vignettes of people and present vignettes of people where they differ only according to their aspirations to marry and have children, the people that are judged to be least good are those that have chosen not to marry and have children. Those that haven't married and children but are trying, we like them more. They're deemed to be better people. And they're deemed to be better people because they bought into what's expected of them. So better to have tried and failed than to have not tried at all. Actually, of course, probably for well-being, that's completely untrue. What it also does is that it enables those people who have tried and succeeded to judge very harshly those that either haven't tried at all or tried and failed. Because if you think about who makes the harshest judgments of different population groups, it's nearly always those people who have done something that the others haven't. So, for example, if you take smoking, who hates smokers more than anyone else? Ex-smokers. Ex-smokers hate smokers. Why? Because if I've quit, they can. Well, most likely, the characteristics of those people that quit will be different from those that don't. Their genes are different, their environment is different, their gene-environment combination is different, the randomness is different. Contextual factors that influence and shape behavior will be different in those population groups. And not just their propensity to exercise free will. Who judges? This is why you have very few advocates or very few very good role models of working class people is because working class people that become successful distance themselves geographically and psychologically from those people that they once were. And they're told to, because you've become from a failure into a success. We're given messaging from very, very early on that what your life circumstances are is not enough. It's not good enough. You need to strive for more. So little wonder then that you distance yourself from the people that you once were when you've succeeded. Enable us to then disproportionately punish and blame those people who lack the genes, environment, and randomness to succeed. And we ascribe everything in the difference that we observe between those population groups, and I'll spend the last minute on this point, to effort and to volition and to control. To the fact that some people are able to work harder because they choose to work harder. That's the important point. Effort we see as something that is endogenous, that is determined by the individual, for the individual. Just think about that for a second, though. If talent is exogenously determined by genes and environment, randomness is clearly exogenous, where's the evidence that effort is something that we choose? Where is the evidence that says that how hard we work is something that we choose? Well, I'll tell you where the evidence is. It's non-existent. It's a story. It's a narrative that we create. There is evidence to show that how hard somebody works is a function of the quality of the relationship they have with their parents and how hard their parents worked. Now, you can say that's chosen, but it's not chosen. It's a function of the quality of the relationship they have with their parents and how hard their parents worked. It would be unsurprising to me, then, if effort is every bit as exogenous, i.e. every bit as determined for the individual as anything else is, including talent and randomness. But we don't like that story. That's not a story that coheres very well. We like the story of agency. We like the narrative of volition and control. And that's not to say that we have none, although we might, actually, but it's to say that the wiggle room for control and choice is very, very limited. And we need to keep that very much in mind when we're making judgments about how other people live their lives, and the choices that they make. And just to be a little more, this is the fundamental message, is just to be a little bit less judgmental and a bit more circumspect about how we judge how other people live their lives, especially when they're making choices that are different to the ones that we think they ought to. Thank you very much. Karen.
Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Good evening. I'm Karen Guggenheim, as Mark said, and thank you so much for having us here tonight. And to Richard, thank you so much. I put on the World Happiness Summit along with my partner, Manuel Pietra. We've had 4 wonderful summits in Miami, and we're very honored to be able to bring this amazing science in the practical sense to a global audience. I'm going to speak to you roughly about 20 minutes, and I'm going to share with you first a little bit about my personal happiness journey and my story and the narrative that I told myself, and then I'll segment into what has given me purpose and meaning in my life, and that is the World Happiness Summit and the science of happiness, and bringing that amazing body of research to as many people as possible. So thank you so much to all of you for being here. So my happiness journey was a bit bumpy. There were some big obstacles along the way. You can say that I came to happiness through unhappiness and pain and trauma. And so roughly 6 years ago, I suddenly lost my husband of 21 years. And obviously, there's shock, there's disbelief, there's disappointment, there's, all these things happening at the same time. There's, our children involved and everything. And during that time, I did have an experience of the choice. So I don't know if the research tells you that some choices are limited versus not, but for me, it was about this awareness, right, and this consciousness that this event had happened that I have no power over, and it's kind of this really rough pill to swallow that you have to deal with. And I had my children, right, and that responsibility of being a mother, and how important that was for me to be there for them and to be useful. It was very important for me to be, if I was going to be there for my children, which I had decided to be, that I needed to be useful and I needed to be a resource to them. So I had this fork in the road moment, and then a very conscious decision that I was going to choose happiness. And I didn't know what, and it sounds trivial, right? But it was life or death, really, for me in that moment. And I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know about a science of happiness. I didn't know about positive psychology. I had graduated and majored in psychology, but positive psychology hadn't been invented. So I had no idea about learned optimism or resiliency or any of these amazing terms that have come about. And what I was able to do is, through purpose and meaning, that was my bridge to happiness, and to really reinventing myself and following through with other decisions that I made. And so I kind of dusted myself off, and I started doing things that happy people tended to do. And when I say happy, contentment, fulfilled, whatever word you want to use, I like the word happiness because it's simple, and we understand that we use it in the vernacular, like Richard says, and so it's a simple term, right? And I went and I re-educated myself, and I started, stimulating my brain, which I find out that that's also, important to be able to reconnect with joy and with hope, right? And I also was very purposeful about the narrative about myself that I was going to tell myself, and that others would tell of me, or that would tell of my children, and how it would relate with my children. I didn't want them to have a narrative of victimhood. And so I think I did have some innate traits, maybe, and maybe it was upbringing or society or whatever it was that made me a little bit more resilient and courageous, and I wanted to kind of be this superhero to myself, right? And to show myself that I could bounce back in incredible pain and disappointment, yes. And one of the things that I've learned about life is that when you realize that life is hard, it gets a lot easier. But we always think that it's going to be rainbows, and it's going to be green lights, and there's not going to be stop signs, there's not going to be traffic, and everything's going to be fantastic. But the reality is that life is hard. And so when I realized that, I was able to be more flexible and to be more hopeful even, right? Which is interesting. So I was really successful in my studies. At first, I was just focused on my studies, but then I started to grow my social circle, and I started to copy what I saw as happy people were doing. Like, they would go out, and so people would say, "Hey, do you want to come to dinner?" Instead of me being my cocoon and so forth, I would say yes. And then very slowly, I was, kind of being reborn and becoming stronger and evolving and so forth. And so when I realized that, and I was able to be conscious of myself and my environment, which is another thing, like Paul was saying, that we make all these decisions kind of in autopilot. But when I took some moments and to really focus on, like, okay, where am I, what am I doing, and bringing myself back to myself and to my body, to my circumstance, I found that my choices would be opening up, because at least I was aware of A, what I was doing, B, what I was feeling, and then what could happen, what I could make happen, right? And so, and I've been very fortunate in having a lot of support, and strong social connections, family, etc. And I began to re-experience life and open myself to life, right? And one of the things that really, when you've experienced loss, is give yourself permission to laugh and to smile. And that was a huge challenge, because there's also, again, the judgment, the judgment that you're supposed to be this person and you're supposed to be unhappy because you've had tragedy, but the tragedy is always inside you, right? That's always part of who you are. But you can still laugh, you can still have hope, you can still, be silly, right? And so I did experience some of that judgment that Paul was talking about, and that was interesting. But, I also experienced a lot of support, a lot of love, a lot of care, and I was able to kind of transform and actually find love again and hope and in a future. And so that was that really ignited and gave me a lot of energy, and I did very well in school, and I had a very good job, etc. But I was unfulfilled at work. I didn't find this meaning, right? And purpose and meaning is so important. And I met a group of people, the volunteers, and they were talking about the science of happiness and putting an event together and so forth. And so my partner Manuel and I started WHASU, World Happiness Summit, to put on this event. Because when we found out that happiness can be learned and can be taught, and having said that, in different scopes and different levels for different people. But what we wanted to do is to put an event together that would unite the world's leading experts in a holistic approach. So we talk about resiliency, we talk about pain, we talk about forgiveness, nutrition, we do yoga, we do all these different kinds of things. We talk about positive psychology, economics, philosophy, virtues. One of the things that, to me, this whole definitely aspect of action is huge. So we talk about gratitude. I have found in my experience that if you're grateful and you practice gratitude, it's very hard to be unhappy. Like, to me, gratitude and unhappiness unhappiness block each other. So one of the things that I do is, when I'm experiencing moments of sadness or despair, I just get into gratitude. There's one of the speakers that comes to the summit, Mo Gaddad. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, Solve for Happy, but Mo lost his son, his 21-year-old son, from an emergency appendectomy that didn't go well. And it really resonates with me when he talks about how he chooses to focus on Ali, that's the name of his son, that Ali lived. Because we always, focus that Ali died, but not the part where they lived, right? And so that's also part of reality. They did live. But if we're stuck on the narrative that they died, which is true, and we can talk about that, but there's also the beauty, the legacy, the joy of the experiences of these people, of the people that we've lost. And so I love the notion of being grateful, being kind, being accepting. And these are all different topics that we talk and discuss at the World Happiness Summit. We were purposeful also in making it as an immersion. It's almost like a primer on happiness. And so I describe it as a buffet, right? And so you have all these different academics and different tools for you to implement in your daily life. And you can pick and choose which ones work for you. And what has worked for me is to start, following some of these practices and see how they start working. And sometimes they're uncomfortable and they're weird, and you've never done them before, and you can throw them away and they don't work for you. But then there's other exercises that after a time they kind of start working, and you start feeling this transformation inside you. And one of the things that I've really realized about this work is that it's not it's not these huge changes that occur very quickly, but they're really small sometimes. And so, but you see the change and the evolution over time. And then, you know, you catch yourself and you're like, well, you know, I'm actually happy. There's something that, whether it's content or I'm not feeling as bad as I was feeling before, I call that happiness as well. And it has been incredibly gratifying to hear the stories from people coming from around the world. People from over 45 countries come, almost all the states in the United States, which if you've been to the United States, it's like 50 different countries. And different ages, so whether it's students or older generation or people in midlife crisis, and they come and something that some speaker says resonates with them, and they have this aha moment. And it's the science, you know, it's the science that, like Paul was saying, that, you know, when it's just self-help or a guru or something like this and not substantiated with the science, then the transformation is not sustainable. So this is about sustainability. How do you have these moments of happiness or joy or contentment that are for a longer period of time, right? And I see that it's a science. It's like being in a swimming pool, and so you have the naysayers, and so how do you get from one side of the swimming pool to the other? Because they're tied here. They're scared of happiness. I find that, you know, from a global perspective, everybody wants to be happy. You know, they see World Happiness Summit and they, oh, you know, I'm not happy. But tell me more. You know, so it's the quest. People really, really want to be happy across the board. We want our children to be happy. Mostly we do everything we do in our daily lives where we're conscious of it or not to be happy, you know. And so the science is really what gets you from one side to the other. It's almost like the wings before you swim, you know. It's brilliant. I mean, the work that these people are doing and that have dedicated their lives to, I think it's a next step for human evolution. And certainly to bring it into communities and to bring it into policy and government. We also hold a private government meeting, of which Manuel is the chair, and we focus there on bringing the science into different countries and into policy. And so we gather largely ministers of finance, and we gather the experts so that they know how to implement it in schools, across the systems, and how to enact laws that will have the focus be people's well-being, which is not necessarily what's going on, right? We focus on everything outside of ourselves, but not in ourselves. And so how do we create communities also that foster happiness, well-being, understanding, kindness, compassion, right? These virtues have really kind of fallen by the wayside, but they're so incredibly important, and it makes us human. It makes us who we are. And just it's about being conscious and compassionate and exhibiting kindness. And Mark asked me to share some of the tools that I have found that increase happiness, at least for myself. So I told you gratitude was one of them, incredibly important. Getting outside and doing any type of physical exercise is fantastic. Even if you go, you know, a couple of minutes to go outside, because then you tell the narrative is not you didn't go again, but the narrative is you become the person who did go, right? And so this whole evolution that happens inside of yourself, you feel like a doer, you feel like you accomplished something, and it doesn't have to be a huge accomplishment. Again, what value judgment are you giving yourself and others? You know, lower the bar, and it's okay to lower the bar as long as you're doing it, right? And you get into a habit of doing healthy things, because largely we're really negative and we're focusing on all the things that are not going well in our lives, when really most of the things in our lives are going really, really well if we just take a moment and look at things in reality, you know. all of us here, we have food, we have shelter, we have, most of us probably jobs, a sense of security, peace, right? And so many places in the world don't have that. And so I think we need to look at our perspective. And so that has helped me a lot to put things in perspective, because if not, otherwise I'm self-absorbed and consume and be like, oh my God, everything's a disaster, when everything is really going well. But that requires purposeful action and how to do that. And we have these amazing experts, whether you're reading a book or listening to a podcast or coming to the World Happiness Summit. You have the ability to learn from these amazing individuals that are so impactful, and the body of their work is so amazing. And it works. It really, really works. And I'm so honored to be here today and to share with you a little bit about my personal journey and the work that we're doing around the summit. And thank you to Action for Happiness for everything that they've done. They've been supporters of us for the last 4 years. And incredibly impactful work, and how we see community and circles really extend this field of not only happiness and well-being, but community that is so important, because it's really about other people and how we can support ourselves and each other. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen. Wonderful. Paul, come and join us. So, folks, still plenty of more food for thought to come. That was just really a starter for 10, really. So we've had a huge amount covered there. We've got some scientific evidence about behavior. We've talked about marriage and relationships. We've heard an inspiring, very moving personal journey. We've sort of thought about how we can bring this to others. I was struck by a few things there that I think we can weave together in some way. So I think I heard from both of you the sense that for those of us that can, as you said, Paul, there's a huge amount that we do have within our control if we have that sort of innate efficacy to make a change happen. And Karen, you've given lovely examples of that. So I'd like to dwell a little bit on maybe some of the specific ideas about, so how can we, those of us that want to be happier, make a change, put that into practice more effectively. But then also I think one of the implications that especially you brought out, Paul, is that not everyone has that capacity to change. And actually, for those of us that want to see a happier world, part of this is about recognizing that there are some people where the best way to improve their well-being, to reduce suffering, is to sort of change the environment, to change the systems, the society we've created around them, rather than to say, come on, get off your backside and make change happen. So I'd like to also think about how we can create a more compassionate society that actually takes that into account and actually does more. So let's do both of those things. Let's come back to the personal change first of all. I was struck by both of what you said, a reminder of a quote which I like, which says, it's easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than to think your way into a new way of acting. And I think you've both illustrated that really powerfully. That's really the mission of Action for Happiness, that when we do something, things change. But maybe we could say a little bit more in your own experiences. So, I mean, Paul, this is perhaps delving a bit more into some of your happiness by design ideas. But although you've said there's no one-size-fits-all, for those of us that want to put this into practice, that we feel a sense of efficacy. So what can I actually do to lower the bar, as Karen said, to make things easier? Where do we begin, from where we are now to put this into practice?
Yeah, so, okay, good, thank you. So the first thing, I suppose, is to be clear that whatever it is that you're going to change or do will actually make you happier, because of the stories that are so powerful. People will have New Year's resolutions like read more books. Do they really want to read more books? Or do they want to be the kind of person that reads more books? Which is somewhat different, right? They have an ideal self as a person who reads more books, when actually they don't really want to read more books. So the first thing is to be really clear about whether that ideal self is consistent with the actual self, insofar as you can be aware of that. And then you want to read more books. So join a book club. Have a screensaver on your laptop that's a book. Have friends that read books. Make a pre-commitment to family and friends that you're going to read a book at a particular time. Create defaults, create environments that make it easier for you to read more books. Then you become the kind of person that reads books. Then you have a narrative consistent with your action. That's it.
So part of that is when we think we want to do something, it's almost like questioning the underlying narrative. And is this really something that's going to be helpful for my own or others' happiness? Or is it more about me fulfilling some narrative or some other person's expectation of what I should be doing?
Exactly. And then when you've determined, and actually a good way to do that is to get feedback from people who either know you very well, or who may have engaged in the behaviour themselves. We do tend to think of ourselves as different and special, and of course we are unique and special and different, but we're very much like other human animals as well. So insofar as it's possible to get that guidance from other people and from those close to you, then, as I say, have implementable plans. In the academic literature, it's called implementation intentions. It's basically having, if reading a book, you don't suddenly have one in your hands and you're reading it. There's a series of steps that need to be taken in order to have the book in your hands. And so what you do is you have a plan that is very detailed and very clear, and that enables you to implement your intentions. The evidence suggests that makes that intention more likely to be completed through into action.
Thank you. And Karen, sort of building on that, you shared, I think, perhaps one of the worst life examples that any of us can have, the loss of a lifelong partner and loved one, and how you sort of rebuilt from there and consciously chose things. I mean, that must have been unbelievably hard. What did you find most helpful in working out, sort of feeling your way through which things were helpful, which things were unhelpful, and building those into sort of positive habits in life? What really helped?
Well, I think that definitely, having a plan, and as much as you can possibly visualize it, and is incredibly important and will give you the greatest chance, I think, to success in what you think you want. But I think, in my case, it was also important to see, because I really didn't know, is to try it, and then all of a sudden, if you hate it, you can pivot into something else. But if you decide you start doing something and you really want to do it, it really helps to have a plan. So in my case, my first step was to go into, I did an MBA with people. I could have done it distant, it would have been easier, but, I wanted to be in a social environment so that I could be with people, so that I could create new relationships, new connections, and I could get out of myself. And so I could get out of the narrative or that I was living in the moment to be able to have a new narrative. And so my plan was that it was to do that and to start that action. Now, I was going on theory that would make me happy. Now, in my case, it worked, right? But I've also tried other things that, that I've been fearless about trying, and maybe I didn't like them, and I stopped doing them. But.
So there's something there about being willing to experiment and also to recognise which things are and aren't working. On that point about, we've talked about lowering the bar and making things simple, but to some extent, Karen's talking about almost going outside your comfort zone. Is that something you've seen much literature to back up?
Yeah, I think, I want to pick up on something Karen, I think that was very powerful that Karen said earlier, was the expectation that she should be miserable, which is, again, because, we expect people that achieve or successful should be happy, and we expect people who experience trauma and other things ought to be miserable, and then that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy to some large extent, because you're then living consistent with what's expected of you. But in terms of what was the question?
Well, I'd sense that Karen was talking about almost like pushing herself outside of a comfort zone or trying something new was one way of experimenting, which of course isn't really lowering the bar so much as being willing to try, I guess.
Having new experiences. There are very few. There are a handful of things that are universally true for happiness, in spite of the individual variation and in spite of my suggestion that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. Listening to music that you enjoy, that's just for everybody. The brain lights up in ways it doesn't for any other stimulant. So, if we all did more of that, unequivocally happier. Spending time with people we like being with, unequivocally happier. Getting outdoors, even for those people who say they don't like being outdoors. Being around nature, biophilia is an important component of the human condition. And having new experiences, trying new things. One of the reasons why time passes so slowly for children and so quickly for adults is that children are constantly having new experiences. Like literally a child is having a new experience every moment, and it makes boiling an egg feel like a lifetime. So you can slow time down by trying new things. And as you said, Karen, the worst that can happen is that you don't like it and do it again, as long as you don't kill yourself.
Or as you said earlier, or harm others, because of course that's another thing.
Or harm others. And the harming, that's really, there's a really powerful message around compassion and altruism and pro-sociality, because those things are incredibly good things to do for ourselves. We need to do much more. I talk about it in various ways in both books, but the celebration of the selfishness of selflessness is something that we need to do much more of as a society. We would get more volunteering. We do get, there's good randomized controlled trials showing this, that you get more volunteering when you additionally tap into the individual benefits of helping others. You get more people volunteer, and they volunteer for longer. You get more charitable giving when you tap into that individual selfishness of helping others. So the idea that we should be doing these things in purely altruistic, almost self-flagellating ways is actually harmful.
Can I say something? So one of the things that I don't know if you're familiar with Tal Ben-Shahar, but he talks about that it's important, there's a magic in the word "and," to be selfish and to be selfful. So to do both, to be selfish, it's okay if you feel fantastic helping people and you're like on a high and you're floating around, and then you're doing something, that's like the perfect balance. It's the beauty of the "and," that is so important.
Well, I think it's that help us high that helps continue our sort of altruistic behaviour. It sort of becomes something that helps it sustain and have that.
But we don't
effect.
Celebrate that anywhere near as much as we ought to. If you type into Google, the world's richest person, you get Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos come up immediately. If you type in the world's highest taxpayer, you get tax avoidance schemes, you get offshore accounts that you can put your money into. There's no celebration of doing good in any sense, in the way that there is about arguably more selfish behaviours. You look at Instagram, you get lots of feedback of people's conspicuous consumption, but very little feedback about their pro-sociality.
So let's because in a moment I want to come to the audience. I'm sure there's lots of interesting questions and observations. But so we've talked a bit about self-efficacy in action, some really helpful ideas, and some universal suggestions around music. I'm not sure. So to share a personal anecdote, I had a joyous experience initially on Sunday when my family, one of my daughters is just learning to play the piano, another one's picking up a guitar. My wife came in and saw the cacophony they were making and got her violin out. And then my son announced that he'd just been given the trumpet to play at school and then got that out. And it was, the dog literally asked to leave the room at that point.
That sounds more like noise than music.
Yeah, but there was something joyous about togetherness, if not music creation. But let's slip from sort of personal efficacy, because a really important point you made, Paul, is that if we follow too far down that line, that we might be at risk of sort of blaming or criticising people who don't have the capacity to quit smoking or change their behaviour or do something. And I think there's an assumption for many that can, that the lazy do nothing, whatever the narrative might be about people who could change but don't. How do we both shift that cultural narrative, but also how could we build a society that does more to look after those people who, for whatever reason, genetically, environmentally, it might be a difficult, abusive childhood, whatever it is, aren't able to change, make a change they might need to make right now? How can we, well, let's do those separately, but how can we shift the narrative about that, and then also what could we do better to support that? And are there some examples around the world where policy is doing that better than, let's say, in modern Western, US, UK type policy making?
I don't know. It's a super difficult question.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any straightforward answer. If I had a straightforward answer, it wouldn't be such a challenge to address. I do think that one of the things that we need to be really much more comfortable with is luck. When people were talking to me about happiness by design, when the press were interested, they were interested in part because there was a professor at the LSE that looked and sounded like this, that wasn't your typical academic, and they wanted the journey and the story of the working class kid from the East End who made it. And I could tell that story. I could tell that narrative. I talk about stammering at the start of Happiness by Design and in kind of ways in which I've dealt with that. But actually, I've been really fucking lucky. I've been really, really lucky. I've been blessed with being clever and humble. And I had many lucky times, but we don't look at that's not the lens that the narrative wanted. That was the journey of of someone who struggled, and I can create that story too. But fundamentally, I've been really, really lucky. And that kind of sense in which we kind of reflect upon all that we achieve and in whatever fields of activity, the kind of reflection on just how much of that is not anything that we've really chosen. I think the more that we can get people to do that, the better chance we have of being able to treat people compassionately. Mm.
And Karen, you've obviously, as well as the World Happiness Summit, you've helped create this H20 gathering of world leaders. You've done a lot to try and bring people together to talk about what would policy look like, what would national directions look like if we made well-being more of a priority. Have you sort of seen any positive moves there? Do you think that we're starting to think about how we might think about the world of economics and policy making differently if we were genuinely caring more about the happiness of everyone?
Well, I can share my perspective. I'm not an expert by any means of the matter, but I think the first step, if we're going to be real, I could, sing you a song and it wouldn't be good, but the reality is that the first step is awareness. That it's a thing, that we need to go beyond just finance and economics. That there's other things happening, and so what we have seen in these meetings, and the last one was in Lisbon. And there were around 100 different countries there at different levels of representation, is that they didn't know this was happening. This was a thing, that well-being, that positive education, that all these different things. I mean, well-being as a concept for a country, of course, they knew that part. But as far as there being a science, right, and that has been largely by most of the countries, not like Nordic countries, but by most of the countries out there, just not aware that this is a thing and this is happening, and it's exciting because there's an appetite for it. Now it's a daunting task because it requires a lot of resources, right, and retraining. To look at that, and so then you're dealing with elections, and these people are there for a period of time, and then when the government changes, the ministers will change, right? And so how do you lay the groundwork and not have an event that is just, a figurehead event, but really how to really make this change in the world and in these countries, and it's about education. And you have to educate at this level so that they know what the benefits are, so they can bring it back into the country. And by the way, there's nothing wrong about it being selfish, that it's going to be good for you. Maybe you get reelected, but you're also doing good for your country. So I think it's okay to have that reality or that conversation as well, that it doesn't matter if they benefit as long as the country benefits as well. And so it's not, again, zero-sum game, but how do we get into these win-win conversations, and how do we make that shift? And it's going to require a long time. I know New Zealand has put it into their national budget for this year, but for the rest of the world, it's going to require a long time, and we have to deal with the pain points, and we can't say, well, it's not working, in this short amount of time, because it's going to take a long time to make this shift. But I think it's possible.
So thank you. And at risk of going down a dark alley, but just because I think it might be of interest to the audience before we finally come to questions, you talked about pain spots. I feel that we're in a cultural pain spot right now with, let's just talk about the rise of populism, for want of another phrase, but we've got a challengingly polarized narrative in our society. Well, narrative may not be the right word there, but we have different narratives that are sort of failing to listen to each other. There's a very us versus them approach that is at the heart of the EU referendum, Brexit stuff, and as sort of in the US. I mean, we've been talking about narratives and stories tonight. Paul, do you see any of what you've discovered in your kind of looking at the narratives around a good life at play here in this sort of the frightening shift we've seen towards polarization in our public dialogue? And is there something we can do to help shift that, do you think?
So why don't you ask a simple question? I do think I do have a thought on polarization, which is that we probably in the 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe to some large degree, that was the odd time. That actually throughout history and society we've been polarized. So when we now look at increased polarization, we're looking at a return to something that represents something that was closer to normal. But it's only just very different to how things were during those decades of more consensus. And if you recast, I have no idea whether that's true or not, by the way, but it's an interesting idea at least. And that it would then then recasts some of how we discuss polarization, because it becomes then more of what is essentially the norm than something that's quite different. In relation to populism, I talk a little bit about that in Happy Above, because populism is used as a really disingenuous bad term, as if being popular and appealing to the masses is always a bad thing. The masses can actually be incredibly tolerant and open-minded. I was brought up with the story of the Battle of Cable Street back in the East End in the 1930s, when an amalgamation of all of the disenfranchised plus people in the East End saw Mosley off, and the fascists who were trying to march through the East End. That was a populist movement. That was a populist movement that was anti-fascist. So I just want to be a bit careful about populism, as kind of it's always like it's those stupid people who are racist and thick, or thick and both. You know, it's kind of, that's the problem. And I think we can galvanise popular and public opinion for the good, as well as for some of the harm that it might be causing right now.
Thank you. Very, very interesting point. Let's come to the audience. So we've got some microphones. Going to see a show of hands if you'd like to either make a brief observation or ask a question. But I'm sure there'll be lots of. Right. So let's come down the front first of all, Adam. There's a lady here with a grey.
Oh, bloody hell! That was a quick run. Bloody hell! It's like you appeared from nowhere. It was like literally a man out of the darkness into the light. Adam, that was incredible.
Over to you.
This better be a good question now. After
Hello. All right. So I've read both of your books. Enjoyed them tremendously. And in one of the books, you compare UK and US. And what stuck with me is example of the responses for the question, would you prefer to be happy but not wealthy, or would you prefer to be wealthy but not happy?
Right.
And the difference between UK and US. So my first question is why you specifically chose comparison between those two countries.
Yes.
And then the other question is, so if, let's say, I'm a person in US and I live there and I want to be happy, I read your book, and now I'm against an environment that is not very, well, the narrative that I have is that I should pick the wealthiness, right? No one's going to support me on that. So I wonder if the logic behind was to pick two countries which are fairly similar, or I don't know if that was the case, but if it was because of the culture, etc., how did it happen that the UK had a completely different set of answers and people valued different things, and then the US had completely different values? And whether would you choose to compare UK, let's say, to Nordics to see how the environment and the values, is it the environment that influences how people choose the values, or is it the other way around, that it forms, then the environment, I'm assuming here, broadly, that Scandinavia would be... Oh, thank you. I know. Or would be that the other way around, that, if you live in Scandinavia, maybe that environment is making it easier for you naturally to be happier, because the narratives are much more relaxed about, let's say, your marital status or what you do for a living, or, just the fact that people will choose what, in truth, you have found out to actually make them happy.
Yeah. So thank you. The first thing to say is that those data are convenient samples that are not representative, and it's to illustrate the points that I'm trying to make in the book. We are actually conducting larger scale studies that are more rigorous and robust, drawing on population samples from different countries other than the US and UK. And there are some differences, as you say, between the degree of endorsement of the narratives in the US and UK. What I think is more interesting is the fact that across the UK and the US, irrespective of the 9 narratives that I talk about in the book, people are in every case more likely to choose the misery-making narrative over happiness for themselves than they are to recommend it for a friend of theirs. And I think that, it could be that they just want their friend not to be as rich as them, but I think it's more likely that they they're constrained, we're constrained, I am constrained to live my life according to what's expected of me, but I don't want you to. And it's easier for me to make a recommendation to you as a friend about how you should live your life than it is to make one about myself, which is why I think if we can find people who care about us, but not the stories that we tell, then there'll be good guides to how we might live a different life or change what we do.
Very interesting. Thank you. Let's come to this side of them. There's a lady here, and then we'll go toward the back. So, Fiona, if we come down here, thank you. Sorry to rob you of your sprint chance, Adam.
That was much more measured.
Hi. So I just wanted to ask, I have nieces and nephews, and I find it difficult because my grandmother was a first-generation immigrant, and she always used to say to us, play the field as it lies, so we're all fairly realist. But I feel like growing up, it's hard to advise them in this sort of social media age where they think being happy is having a boyfriend and having this top and having that. How would you talk to young people who are sort of in this cycle of comparison about the concepts such as finding your own path to happiness, leading a different life than the template? I mean, is it too early to talk to them when they're teenagers about this thing?
It's probably too late to talk to them when they're teenagers about it. See, I don't think, I mean, social media is very interesting. Again, we've got no randomised controlled trials, so I can't speak unequivocally about the evidence. But social media can, in terms of the social narratives, I mean, lots of things we could say about social media that beyond that. But in terms of the narratives, they can be a force for good, because now I can see lots of other people out there who are weirdos like me, whereas before I was the only one in the village, right? So now I see a world of heterogeneity, and I can see difference, and so I then can live a life different to the one that might be expected of me. On the other hand, what social media can do, and probably does overwhelmingly, is magnify existing narratives. And so now, not only am I spending a fortune on my wedding to show off to 100 people, I can now show off to 100,000. And so there's an arms race in showing myself to be a person that, you know, loves my wife so much to spend £100,000 on the wedding. So it magnifies those narratives. And you're right. I mean, it's a really, really difficult question and challenge about how you engage with people, and children in particular, to make them alert to some of those dangers. And I don't know that we can do it with, and this is where the kind of societal change comes in. It's not done at the individual level with our own. I mean, I've got a daughter who's now in secondary school, started this year. You know, we're managing. We don't know how to. We don't know as parents. I think myself as a reasonably well-informed parent, I don't know how to manage that social media use to on the one hand enable her to have social interactions with people, on the other hand try to mitigate some of the harm that social media causes. We're muddling through the best way we can in how to do it. I think it's incumbent upon governments, societies, the tech giants. The tech giants, you know, they don't let their children anywhere near these kind of technologies that they're selling to us. I mean, it's literally crack for kids. You know, you've got primary kids starting school who are swiping books, right? Because they've never seen a book, they've just seen the iPad. You know, that can't be good. And so to sort of expect that parents individually can do it, or even in groups in schools can do it, is a bit overwhelming. I think we need regulation like we have with you know, once we were late with tobacco. We were a long while after we knew the evidence about the harms before we regulated properly. I think we're going to reach the same conclusions about social media use. You know,
Can I just add?
I was going to say, you have children. What's your view on that?
Well, I think that beyond having children, I think it's also brings a responsibility to the schools and to the community. So I think that we also need to bring in this research and this science into the school system and train teachers so they can bring it to kids, so that we can, you know, expose them to technology, because they will have technology. There's no way around that, and social media is part of it. But how do you use social media in a positive way? What are the effects of overusing it? What happens to your brain? How are you going to feel? Do you remember the time you felt this way? So if we have, you know, and not only social media, right, but also other things that are important for mental health and for how, you know, that we kind of revolutionize how we're educating our kids on a systemic way, I think is incredibly important. Because much of the education is outside of yourself. So you learn this because it's prescribed. You're supposed to know physics and chemistry and this language and that language and all these other things. But we really don't teach them or give them any opportunity to get in touch with themselves. And so what makes them happy, what gives them purpose. I mean, they're people too, so they need meaning, they need purpose, and they need to feel important and like they matter, right? And in a sense of community, and what does healthy community look like, and what is kindness, and what is virtue, because we don't have that anymore. We don't teach that to our kids. And they're so exposed to so much that we weren't exposed at such an early age. And so I think it's really important. And so those are some of the things that we're doing, and we've started in Miami, is in bringing the science into the curriculum, into the school. So we started in schools, and we have like a pilot program where we're bringing it into the curriculum as part of curriculum.
Great. I love this question and what it brought up for me, and I think what you've both said is very wise. But what I see with my now beginning to be teenage kids is a huge amount of pressure from the school system to perform and be perfect, from their social context to look a certain way and be a certain thing. The thing I feel I can do as a parent is to say, these things are real. You want to do your best at school. You want to try and stay connected with the social group. But we love you and value you for who you are, not because of the grades you get and because of how you look. Because I think the really most important thing is that all of us need to grow up feeling that somebody cares for us sort of unconditionally, not because of how we look and because of what we achieve. And I think that so much of the pressure on young people in particular lacks that sense of you're okay as you are. And that, I think, is the most toxic thing. Right, let's come to the back of the room. So back to this side of the room. Is that Nick with his hand up over there? Oh, this would be good. Excellent.
No pressure. Is it on? Yeah, no pressure then. Humans are very motivated by the now. Extinction and rebellion are on the streets. Climate change is coming. Paul, you touch a little bit on your book about the relationship between consumption and happiness. Could you expand a bit about, is there a hopeful narrative that we can create a happier, sustainable world in there, if we drop some of the narratives of today? And how do we get over that motivation of the now and we want to consume now?
God, Jesus. Now I've got to fucking solve climate change. Right, okay, so... I think that we need to find ways of getting feedback about what we do affecting how we feel, and particularly in relation to consumption. That actually more stuff doesn't always make us feel better. And actually more stuff does make you feel better if you're poor. And so poverty, that's the thing we need to always be reminded of that. That poverty makes people miserable, and the consumption of more goods and services when you're poor does increase happiness significantly, insofar as we have data on consumption and happiness, which is quite weak. But the problem is that then we get addicted, don't we? It becomes like a sort of so it isn't that it's wrong, like that relationship between consumption and happiness isn't wrong at lower levels because it makes sense. But it's just that we can't remember and remind ourselves that the next bit beyond that has quite diminishing marginal returns. And so there's something about being able to remind ourselves individually that feedback that we get, that additional consumption is now past the point at which it's good for us. And then societally, I think Extinction Rebellion are reminding us, as protest groups and civil action does, that it's kind of recasting the conversation. And I think that taking what would otherwise be seen as extreme policies are now being seen as maybe not so extreme and sensible. What I'd like to see is much more relationship between addressing poverty and climate change. Because some of what's required, if we met Extinction Rebellion's need, would disproportionately affect poor people. And some ways in which we can galvanise both concerns for poverty and the climate would be a kind of better way of addressing those issues, both of those issues, consumption and climate change.
It's another very deep and challenging question. Just one, we are going to do an event, I think, on happiness and sustainability and Extinction Rebellion and so on next year, because we've got a number of people in our movement who are sort of closely linked to that. What I've been struck by what's happening on the streets is is this sort of mindful approach to civil disobedience that is grounded in both respectful conversation and trying to keep the public on side whilst also still being civilly disobedient and doing some quite disruptive things. And I think that's a really difficult tightrope.
Yeah, I mean,
the idea, genuinely helping to
No, it is, and the idea is to get
and
arrested because some evidence suggests that that's, you know, the number of arrests is an indicator of the success of a civil disobedience movement. But I also think, but in relation to happiness, is that you're going to have it's a much easier sell, because it is a sell, you know, it's essentially selling to some large degree, if you can show that these changes are consistent with being happier and not harmful. And actually they are. I mean, actually most of what we ought to be doing to save the planet is actually good for us as individuals. But often it's kind of dressed up as either you care about the environment or you maximise happiness in the here and now. And that's where I think getting the feedback that actually some of these pro-environmental behaviours actually make us feel good.
And to give credit to Nick, his Happy Planet Index that was trying to look at happiness and sustainability for decades has been a great example of trying to unite those two different strands. Thank you. So let's come back to this side of the room. Was there a hand up towards the back there? Yes, this lady here. Adam, you could do a sprint round to this lady if you can, or you can race Fiona. Oh.
Got there first.
Thank you so much. I just have one question. I mean, I'm a psychologist myself and have worked in many different cultures. And one of the things that struck me is that the notion of happiness is very different from one culture to the other. And if you ask people what makes them happy, it really does vary tremendously depending on where they grew up, what culture they were from, the conditions around which they were brought up and culturated. And I wondered how you define happiness given the cultural variation and nuances of context, and to be able to generalize that. I mean, how does one define happiness that takes into account these different factors?
Can I just give a very quick answer? It won't be sufficient, I don't think. I want to give Karen an opportunity to say more about that. But happiness, but pleasure and purpose are the twin principles on which I've based happiness by design. It's been translated into lots of different countries, into different languages. I haven't had anybody yet say that our culture that this doesn't fit our culture. That's not to say that it doesn't, but I've just not had the feedback that it seems to resonate. That twin objectives between the eudaimonic and the hedonist thing kind of seem to kind of resonate broadly well across different cultures.
Well, we were having a conversation about this earlier, and I do agree that, you know, I agree with what you're saying, Paul. I also think that different cultures, how do I say this? Not experience, but communicate happiness in a different way. So, for example, the Portuguese, they have a word called saudade that is, you can't translate it, and it's not translatable in other languages, and it's about this kind of sweet melancholy, and it's not unhappiness, but it actually is a longing that makes you kind of happy, or you know, that you're. So here you have some concept that you can't even translate it into another context, and if you're there, everybody tells you they're miserable. I'm miserable. And what did you do today? Well, you know, I went to the beach. I was with my friends. We had a 4-hour lunch. So, and they have community, and they have laughter, and they have friendships that are decades long. And if they lose a job, they can live, you know, with the community. So, to me, I see that, and then I live in the U.S. and I see so much aggression and so much competition, and you know, yes, we have everything, you know, 75 of everything, and on every scale, you know, we should be doing great, yet we're rushing, we're eating in front of a computer, we're having digestion problems, heart attacks, opioid epidemics, obesity, suicides. The suicide epidemic in the United States is frightening. And so, you know, there are different ways, I think, on how comfortable you are socially saying, hey, hi, how are you? Well, I'm really happy. Because we like to complain, because then, I don't know, it's like well, I had a lousier day than you had, you know, and we get into this conversation, but maybe even this jabbing back and forth is making me happy because I'm playing with you. So, you know, it depends, I think, also what day you get people to do the surveys and those kinds of things.
So thank you for that question, because I think the cultural thing is really important. I think my feeling on this, having worked with Action for Happiness for a decade or so now, is that I feel happiness is universal, that we all know what it feels like to experience a sense of pleasure and purpose, that sort of happiness in its different contexts, and we want that for our loved ones. It's what parents say they most want for their children. What differs, and I think what you're right about your question, is that what causes us to be happy varies hugely, both across personality types, people, contexts, and cultural environments. But that feeling of life feels good right now, and this is what I want for myself and my loved ones, is a universal part of the human
Can I say,
condition.
though, when parents say they want their children to be happy, I don't think that's true. It's true that they say it, but what they should really finish that sentence with, if they are being honest, is I want my kids to be happy, doing the things that I think ought to make them happy, and having the kinds of jobs and careers that I think they ought to have.
But that's partly
because I actually genuinely do think that that's going to make them happy. But also, we shouldn't forget that actually makes us feel good about ourselves when we can celebrate our children's successes. So I kind of, whilst I agree with you, that's what people say, I'm not convinced that that's what they really mean.
Well, it also makes you a successful parent.
Exactly,
you know?
exactly.
Lovely.
Exactly.
Let's end on a moment of controversy. As well. I'm afraid we're out of time, folks. I'm sure Paul and Karen
I wouldn't have cut across you if that was the end.
We'll be happy to continue conversations. We've got copies of both of his great books here. We've got flyers about Wuhasu. We'll send out some more information tomorrow. There's one more announcement I'd like to make, but before I do any more, please join me in giving a huge thank you tonight to our guests this evening, Paul and Karen.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark, for the work that you do and the volunteers. Thank you so much for organizing.
Thank you.